towards enlightenment. Because ultimately what transpersonal history says is that the purpose of history is to unfold us, both individually, collectively, and socially, towards greater and greater states of awareness, enlightenment, and love. That's the point of history. That's why we're here. We're not here to suffer like the poor people in the towers on 9/11 suffered and had to jump for their lives on fire. Can you imagine the shock and the horror of having to do that? I can't. Well, I can imagine, but that's why I've written this book, because of the horror of seeing those people jumping out of a building on fire and knowing that somebody had done that deliberately. And my job as a doctor of history is to find out who did it. Okay? And I talk then about what it is actually to be a professional historian. What is the craft of history? Okay, so what you do is you come up with hypotheses of explanation. So you look at a historical event, I don't know, the origins of World War I. That's a favourite thing we all had to write essays on at the University of London, and different learned professors have written treatises about the origins of World War I. It was the Serbs' fault, it was the Austrians, it was the Russians, it was the Germans' fault, it was the British, whatever. And you write your essays, you test the hypothesis against the evidence, you look at diplomatic exchanges, you look at memoirs, you look at letters, you look at old photographs, and you compile the evidence. And you're ultimately looking for causality. You're looking for why things happen. The craft of history is not just sort of telling the story, it's telling the story of why it happened. And it's therefore looking at invisible things behind the outer story. Yes, the Archduke was assassinated. Austria mobilized, threatened war on Serbia. Russia threatened to counter-mobilize and defend Serbia against Austria. Then Germany threatened to counter-mobilize against Russia. But then France threatened to counter-mobilize against Germany. And then Britain threatened to counter-mobilize and support France. So suddenly all the dominoes are going haywire. Well, where's the causality? Who's actually responsible? That's a really interesting question, World War I. And if you factor in the role of capital and markets and empires and industrialization and so on, you see that actually it was a juggernaut, a sort of process that got out of hand. There's a famous historical story, which is true actually. The Kaiser, who is always blamed by a sort of old-style English nationalist historian. I'm not of that kind, I'm a global historian. But the old school used to say it was all the Kaiser's fault. He was a megalomaniac and wanted war. Couldn't be further from the truth. He actually did his best to stop the war. He was on holiday in Norway at the time when things started looking grim. And he was in a fjord, having a lovely holiday. He loved Norway. He didn't want war in Europe. He knew it would be a catastrophe, whatever happened. And he reluctantly went back to Berlin, and his generals bullied him into launching the war as a preventative strike through Belgium to France, because they were going to be suddenly surrounded by French and Russian attacks simultaneously. And they thought, quickly we can knock France out and then we can defend ourselves against Russia. That was the plan. He wasn't convinced. He thought the whole thing was a mistake. But the British were refusing to negotiate. The British press had whipped up anti-German hysteria. And it looks like British capitalism and its financial interests were trying to destroy Germany and to actually foment the war and bring it into a global conflict, which is shocking and scandalous. And that's been revealed by some very in-depth research by two Scottish historians in the last 10 years who've sort of rewritten the book on this. It looks like Britain actually wanted this war for its own selfish capitalist interests. But like so many things in history, you have to peel away the layers of veracity. That's a hypothesis, it might be true. Okay, what happened was that the attempts to make peace between the Kaiser and the Tsar were unsuccessful. They got into personal discussions and were trying to make peace. Neither of them wanted war Russia knew it would be a disaster for Russia. As it turned out, it led to his downfall, the downfall of the Russian Empire, the death of himself and his wife and his family, and the advent of Leninism and Bolshevism. He sort of knew all that. So he was trying to stop the war. The Kaiser knew it would be a disaster. It turned out to be one for Germany. Catastrophic. It was the end of the Reich. The German Empire collapsed. And you had the rise of a mad corporal, Hitler, who was just a corporal in the war and who was shell-shocked and half bonkers, and who acted as rallying force for, resentment. Now, so they saw all this coming and they desperately tried to stop it. And they exchanged telegrams and so on. This is all given in this book by the Scottish historians. And there was a Russian ambassador being sent with personal instruction by the Tsar to sign a treaty with the Kaiser. We will not go to war, a peace treaty. And this was a few weeks before the war broke out. And what it turns out, according to the research, is that the Russian foreign minister heard about this. He was in the pay of British intelligence, right? That's the allegation. I suspend judgment. He was in the direct pay of British intelligence. He ordered the ambassador of peace to be hauled off the train, sitting on the platform in St. Petersburg, about to go to Berlin and stop the war. He was hauled off and stuck in a jail in secret. Well, that's treason. That's treason against the Russian people, against the Tsar, and it caused the war. This is why history is so exciting. I mean, these guys give all the evidence, they show the text, they claim to be able to prove this. I suspend judgment. You see, what historians do is we practice what's called epoche, which is a term from Greek philosophy. It means you suspend judgment on a contested hypothesis, right? The hypothesis here is that British intelligence paid Russian foreign ministry to facilitate the war against the will of the Tsar and in direct opposition to the foreign ministry. I mean, this is such a major thing. It should be studied by all, trained historians. Okay, meanwhile, we do epoche, right? So that's an example, that's a glimpse of the craft of history at work. That's about causality. And as I say, as I speak, it's still, I suspend judgment on this one. But it looks grim for the British role in the causality. You see, what I was taught as a British historian is Britain's innocent of all this stuff. We only do the wars when we have to at the last minute. It's all their fault. We went into World War I to help our allies in France because we're a plucky little nation and we went to support them all in the trenches and we're the good guys. And the Germans were horrible. They were bonkers and Kaiser was mad. That's what we're taught. But it doesn't look like that's actually truth. The job of the historian is to separate out the propaganda from the truth. Well, that's a philosophical question. What is truth? I'm coming to that. So, I talk about the craft of history, then I talk about the role of ignorance in history. Because, gosh, I've spent years studying philosophy and wisdom and trying to become wise and trying to teach it. But the world seems to be getting stupider and stupider. You get Trumps in power. I mean, the guy can't even run a casino. You get people like Boris Johnson in power who can't even tie up his shoelaces and tell a straight answer to a straight question. I mean, I'm appalled that we have people of that caliber now with their fingers on the nuclear button. I come from a different world. Where I was brought up, we were taught to tell the truth, and that people only got into power and politics if they were good and had integrity. I've fallen down the wrong rabbit hole here. So what I've started doing as my kind of counter thing is to study ignorance in history. I realise it's a huge force. I was thinking that we were all looking for wisdom and how to be good, how to advance enlightenment, how to advance truth. And, meanwhile, ignorance is winning. And I talk about Sophia-phobia and how historians actually don't want to know the truth. some types of historians become just apparatchiks for a system of ideological control in a given regime, which has sometimes a theological, sometimes a political raison d'etre. And what these historians are just paid pens to write up the narrative that satisfies the ruling classes of that epoch or that culture or whatever. This has been true since ancient China, since the ancient Islamic world, since Solomon built his temple, since the day one, since writing was invented actually in Egypt and Sumeria. The historian is the scribe that just writes what the pharaoh wants. Well, that's one type of historian, and they don't really want the truth, and they want to spread a sort of comfort to the people, a Netflix of bits of truth, enough to keep people watching, but not the actual truth, because that'll make them turn off and, march on Buckingham Palace. So I talk about Sophiaphobia, and this is a word I've coined, it means the fear of wisdom, the fear of knowledge. So there's a sort of anti-history at work of people that suppress knowledge, suppress truth, deliberately or undeliberately. So it's either consciously, and that's the KGB people that arrest intellectuals and torture them and stuff, or the Nazi death squads or whatever, killing off the intellectuals of Europe because they weren't Nazi enough. Or it's the unconscious suppression of truth, whereby we don't look at stuff. I know countless people that say, no, I never read the newspapers, no, I don't watch television, I can't stand finding out what's going on in the world because it's all so horrific. So we deliberately block out stuff. Whereas I say, no, absorb what the media tells you, but filter it through the screen of your own growing awareness. And so I then talk about truth in history. What is truth then? How can how can historians actually discern what is true from what is false? Well, there's tried and tested methods, and I talk about like putting in a groundwork for a philosophical history. It was Voltaire that coined the phrase, the philosophy of history. That's the kind of inner juice or meaning of history. And Voltaire lived in a turbulent time, just as we are now. He kept his nerve, and he said, we need to study the wisdom traditions of all epochs, all ages. And we need to apply those criteria in our search for a common narrative, a search for common truth. He's one of the figures of the Enlightenment in European thought, which I follow in the footsteps of, in my own little way. Okay, that's part one, and that's like a book in itself. Then I go to part two, which is an attempt to reconstruct an actual history of 9/11. So here I give the narrative, based on innumerable sources, works, journalist reports, etc. I try to give a moment-by-moment breakdown of what happened, so far as we can tell, on 9/11. Because history is also the what happened. It's the facts of, the objective unfolding of events in three-dimensional space and time. So I go into great detail, and then I talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, and the consequences of the events of 9/11, and why it matters that we find out the truth of what happened. I talk about the official narrative, which is it was Bin Laden running a bunch of people that hijacked 4 planes and brought down the Twin Towers and crashed into the Pentagon and were going to hit the White House, but crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. That's the official Bush narrative. Now I talk about that and I explain why that can't be true. I go into great detail in the book based on other people's research. This is not something I wasn't there. I don't have first-hand, I've not interviewed the witnesses, but I've read reports of people who interviewed witnesses, and so much unravels with that official narrative. So I then explore, how it unravels. And that's a lot to do with the material evidence of the buildings collapse, and the fact that those planes can't have brought the buildings down. The fact that there were explosions going off in the basement before the buildings even started to fall. And the fact that people inside the buildings attested to all this. This is historical proof for all, another cause, as well as the impact of the planes. And I'm going with the assumption there were actually planes. I'm not one of these people that thinks they were like fake images. I think that's a bridge too far. Seems to me there were planes. And I'm prepared to believe that probably some of these hijackers that were named might well have been involved with it all. But what it seems to me is that there was a lot more going on behind the scenes than we've been led to believe. So I then talk about why the consequences of 9/11 were so horrendous, and why the catastrophe of Iraq happened on its back, Afghanistan. There was a continuing failure to address the need for peace in Israel and Palestine. And then conflicts have broken out in Syria, Libya, and so on. All because of this 9/11 event. And there's also been a rift in USA and USSR relations, or Russian relations, over Syria, and also between Western and Iranian relations. All down to 9/11 and its consequences. So what I do is I therefore say, look, it's really important we find out what actually happened and don't accept what's obviously a false or imperfect narrative. Part of the job of being a historian is you test the hypotheses, you see what's true, and if it's not true, you look for alternative hypotheses. And that's my duty. Okay, part 3 is simply saying, well, what are the sources? If we are going to write the definitive history of 9/11, let's say 100 years from now, as a team of historians in the future come across my book and they're trying to write the actual facts of 9/11 in full, in depth, what do they need? Well, they need access to all the literature that's been written about 9/11. And here I give a hugely detailed review of all the books I could find hitherto published on 9/11. They're journalistic studies, they're eyewitness accounts, they're reports from people who were in New York who saw stuff. They're attempts by various investigators to research aspects of it. And I go into detail, I give a critical review of the literature, of what's been found out. And I say, well, that's what we need, is all these books need to be gone through, and all the authors interviewed, and, loads of questions arise. But what nobody had done before this attempt is put them all together into a synthesis. There's never been an attempt to apply a sort of professional historical lens over this. And I looked, nobody's done a PhD thesis on this. No, nobody, I can't believe it, in America or Britain or France or anywhere. I mean, there have been studies like, 9/11 through the journalism of German newspapers or something. Somebody doing a journalism PhD. But nobody's attempted this, the overview. Okay, so then I talk about, well, what else do we need to know and have access to as historians? Well, the first thing is we need the emails that were exchanged on that day by all the different actors. We would have to go and get clearance and access to the email records of, the world's intelligence agencies and academics and so on. We need the phone records of people, who was ringing who on the day. We need the bank records, who was making transactions from the towers in the hours before it fell, who was paying the janitors to let people into the building to pre-wire it, as is one hypothesis. We would need all the oral testimony of people that lived through the event. We need filmed and video evidence, on which there's many clips on the internet, but we need to make an exhaustive inventory of it all and see it from all possible angles. I mean, it's possible some of these films have been faked, We'll only know when we compile the whole lot. We need to look at the materials evidence, Richard Gage and the architects and engineers. What was the rubble made of? Did it really have nanothermite in? Why was it all shipped immediately off to China? I mean, that is so suspicious. It's a crime scene. And yet the Bush administration just gaily ships it all away. I mean, if that doesn't tell us something, I don't know what does. We need legal and court evidence. Some cases have come to court dealing with aspects of the 9/11 issue, and there are other cases ongoing. Well, all that needs to come before the Historical Commission as evidence. We need police records from the day in America and from also obviously Washington and Pennsylvania. There seems to be no plane bits found in the Pennsylvania so-called crash. I mean, where's the police records of what was discovered? We also need access to all the various confessions that have come forth. People saying, yeah, I know 9/11 was an inside job, I'm dying, and here I'm recording my last thoughts. There's several of these type of things around. Well, they all need gathering up and listening to and going through. Does WikiLeaks have any information? Why has nobody leaked anything to WikiLeaks? Now, of course, Julian Assange is right now, locked up, can't speak out. I'd love him to be interviewed. I hope he gets free soon. And he might want to add something to what WikiLeaks knows. We need knowledge of the Air Force. What was the American Air Force and the Canadian, to some extent, doing, flying around? What were their pilots talking about? Why did nobody try and shoot the plane down? The planes. We need flight data, therefore, from the air traffic controllers, comprehensively, all of it. And then we come to an interesting bit, which is to do this job properly as a historian, we need access to intelligence records. Now, that normally doesn't come out for decades. The great historian of British intelligence, who's written histories of MI5 and there's a thing at the University of Cambridge that meets for historical scholars interested in intelligence research. When I did my PhD, began my PhD at the University of London, I worked partly studied at the LSE, where they do a lot of work on intelligence history. So it's a field in its own right. And of course, it's really difficult to tell who's telling the truth, who's got an agenda. And so really the top intelligence historians of Britain, America and all the rest of it need to come together objectively and gain access to the intelligence records in the respective and relevant countries, in the USA and the UK and other countries. But also we need to work with intelligence experts in China because, as we'll see, China is relevant here and they may know things. Also in Israel, again, Israeli intelligence, very top-notch, they kind of may know some things about this, so they should be interviewed. Likewise with Saudi Arabian intelligence. What did they know? Were they keeping tabs on Bin Laden? It'd be really interesting to interview people from Saudi intelligence, what they knew about the events of 9/11, both in the lead to it and afterwards. It looks like the Saudi embassy in Washington knew it was coming. It looks like they had links to Mohammed Atta and some of the other so-called, plane hijackers because they were giving money transactions to them. This was revealed in the part of the Bush narrative that was then redacted and it wasn't released initially. It was finally released, and I give the transcripts in the book in which this is revealed that the Saudi embassy had definite links to some of these hijackers. What are they doing giving them money? Was it Saudi Arabia that was backing this whole operation? And if so, did American intelligence not know? Or did they find out and they were silenced? And if so, by whom? Did Israel know? There are lots of very interesting questions arise if we do that work. And that's what's got to be done. Otherwise, we can't ever find out who did 9/11. Now, if you say to me, oh, Thomas, you're just a dreamer, you'll never get access to intelligence records. Well, maybe not in the present state of geopolitics, but I live in I live for a different world, which is based on non-violence, truth, and love. and genuine scholarship. I'm not a paid hack for any regime. You know, I'm an intelligence agent for the kingdom of God, as I call myself to the kids when they ask me in, you know, classes and stuff. And therefore my allegiance is to the kingdom of truth. And all I'm saying is if we're going to turn this planet around and get it back, win it back for the people, win it back for the liberty of the community, as Franklin Roosevelt called it, win it back for love, win it back for authentic Christianity, authentic Islam, and authentic Judaism, and all the others, Buddhism and so on, and Druidry, then we're going to have to start finding out the truth. And we, the people, have to take control back of the intelligence agencies, the CIAs, the MI6s, and so on. These guys, they're like thugs, robbers. They've stolen my country, you know, with their fake intelligence postings and stuff. They're not doing their job. Whoever was British intelligence on the day of 9/11, so we need access to their records. Who was working for MI5, MI6 in New York? What were they texting each other? What were they saying on the phone? Were they saying, yeah, it's going down, it's great, isn't it? You know, let's find out from the records. And we, the people, have the right. You know, this is like from the Gladstonian perspective. We need an ethical foreign policy, and that means we need an ethical intelligence service. I've never worked for the intelligence service for any country because I won't lie. I'm a man of truth and non-violence, and I won't participate in lies for military, you know, skullduggery. Okay, we also need fire department records and testimony. Who was there? Who responded? Who helped put the fires out? And what did they find? What did they say? I mean, the fire people thought that this was manageable, and strictly in terms of a fire, the fires on the top, you know, on the sort of middle top floors of both Twin Towers were manageable. They could have got people up there and put them out. And all the evidence is that these are manageable. You see, no plane impact with that amount of jet fuel could have brought the towers down. That's what Richard Gage and the architects have told us. If you're not familiar with that research, then please, you know, listen to it, go online, do your research. Let me just repeat, the Twin Towers could not have been brought down by the impact of the planes alone. There was a lot of jet fuel, but most of it burned up very quickly, and a lot of it outside the buildings. Yes, it caught fire to things burned, but not enough to create this, what's called the pancake effect. And certainly not enough to do what we then witnessed, which was the sudden free-fall collapse of both buildings, as they turned virtually into dust, as Julie Wood describes it, dustification. Something else, therefore, was involved. Now, the something else is probably the pre-wiring of the buildings. That's a logical explanation. So we need to look at that. And the fire department of New York must have records of all this. They must have worked this out themselves. They need to be able to say to a team of historians, academically, you know, yeah, that was the guy, he told us that on the next day, that, you know, this was some pre-wiring job or whatever. Then we need to look at, obviously, historical studies that have been done by any proper trained historians. Very few. I can't find hardly any. We need evidence brought before truth commissions. There have been a few. There was hearings in Toronto and in Vancouver and elsewhere. All of those transcripts should be made available to the Historical Commission. We also need access to the USA cabinet records. So the cabinet under Bush was meeting. Dick Cheney and all the others were all meeting in private discussions. Now, what of that was recorded? Was it written down? Is it available? Do we have the tapes? What were they saying? All that needs to be gone through. We also need all the transcripts of the US presidential briefings that he was giving throughout this entire time. What was he saying, Mr. Bush? Starting with his pet goat speech in Florida, you know, with his shifty eyes looking around as if he sort of had some pre-knowledge of what was going on and didn't therefore bother to react. We also need the evidence of the Secret Service. The President is protected by a body called the Secret Service. What did they overhear? What did they hear him saying? Who came and saw him? What was he saying on the plane that started circling around? Because they stuck Bush in the air very quickly to get him out of harm's way, so-called. Well, what was he talking about on the plane? Where are those records? We also need psychiatric and psychological evidence. So medical evidence from anybody in and around New York or anywhere in the world that has, somebody's gone to them and said, I've got a real big load on my conscience because I helped plan 9/11 and I think I'm going bonkers, and please help me, doctor. Somebody somewhere might have those kind of medical issues, and I think this is an occasion when medical confidentiality is overridden by ethical duty to truth. I think that when things are this grave, you have to kind of step up and share the truth. I also think that that's true of church, confessions. I mean, I'm just speculating, but if Tony Blair, after he became a Catholic, went to his priest and said, Monsignor, I've got a big load on my conscience. I launched the war of Britain in Iraq in 2003, knowing the whole thing was a con, knowing they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and knowing that 9/11 was a fake job, that our intelligence people helped the Saudis and the Israelis and the Americans to plot the whole thing. We did it for a year beforehand. And now I'm really worried because it looks like I might have brought the world down. But I'm really a nice guy and I believe in God, and please will you absolve me and tell me what my sins are. If some priest somewhere heard a confession like that, I think they need to come forward. And, anyone else that was involved in this horrendous nonsense. And of course, if they didn't, that's fine. I mean, but I'm just saying if. The other thing that we have to be aware of in looking for evidence, and don't forget this is a chapter dealing with evidence, is whether there's been bias in evidence gathering and analysis. Have people... I mean, the Bush Commission don't seem to have done anything that conforms to normal historical evidence gathering. They just... Actually, it's been said, they created the narrative first and then superimposed it on the evidence. The business about how the buildings collapsed, again, NIST created the story and then superimposed it on the facts. Against all criteria of proper architectural investigations after a building's collapse. So some evidence has been also lost and some has been destroyed, like the destruction of the material remains. Tapes that were taken outside the Pentagon, for instance, of the alleged plane flying in, they all need to be found and analysed to get the proper history. Same with all the cameras that were, in New York around the Twin Towers. The same with the black boxes that were on the so-called 4 planes. Never been found, never been released. Again, they're all needed, the evidence of the black boxes, which cannot have been destroyed because they withstand impacts like this. Then there's evidence that's been deliberately tampered with. So fake evidence that's been planted. Like the passport that traditionally survived this cataclysm was found, one of the so-called terrorist hijackers' passports was found unblemished on the sidewalk in New York, This is obviously fake evidence that's been planted. We also want the financial records, as I've said, of all the trading before and after and even during 9/11 events. We're talking millions and millions of financial transactions were going on. They all need analysing and studying historically. This is a historical work, I'm saying. And this is, quite